We heard them talking about Papo bulls, that's the right way, Papo bulls? Toro. The Dias Benedictum, this was after Columbus came, 1493, the Pope, Alexander the Sixth, and that new lands could be colonized only if indigenous inhabitants could be converted to Christianity. And this sets a precedent that establishes the church, divine right and authority to Christianize the world. And that's still in effect today.
Really?
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Which one are we on? First one?
Up here, the Papa Bowl, 1492, that is Philadelphia. So, when you look at the history of all those conquistadors and all those explorers, there was always a clergy with them, because that was their job, as well, in terms of claiming new land in the south. So that, and what the professor had to say there too, Miller, about all those other top of bowls that were going on, was all about conquest. So we're going to speed ahead here to our first treaty, the Haudenosaunee. So at that time there was 5 nations: the Mohawk, the Oneida, Onondaga, Cayuga, and Seneca nations. They had formed a confederacy. Some elders say it was over 2,000 years ago. And historians will tell you that, well, that was about the 14th century, somewhere in there. And since they've been doing those recitals, they've been doing a lot of researching and stuff as well. And one of the things that came out of that is that there was an occurrence that happened in Seneca territory during the time of the peacemaker. There was a total eclipse, and then I think it's in 6 years there's going to be one in that same area, a total eclipse. Because in the Great Law it makes reference to that the day will become night. And this was towards the end, because the Senecas were the last ones to come in and accept. And they were very, very warlike, just like the Mohawks were. And they were hesitant, because they were fighting out this way. We got stories of where people coming all the way out here, before we came, all up to Mississippi, up to the Hudson Bay, down to the Everglades. And so they were at war with the nations to the west of them. And they didn't want it, because they were afraid that if they were to accept that, then they would come and annihilate them. But they say that the peacemaker, he went all over and talked to other indigenous nations, not just ours. And so they were hesitant. And they told them, well, show us a sign, that you do have this power, that this, what you're doing here is a good thing. And so what he told that leader, he says, tomorrow the day is going to become night. And so they said, yeah, right. Probably never ever seen a total eclipse, eh? And so then the leader says, well, if that happens, then we'll accept. And it did. And so, just like the Mohawks, they had their little contest with him too. But that brought him in. And so when you do that astronomy, is that the word? You study the stars and the sun and when it lines up and there's a total eclipse astrology or whatever it is. You can go back into history and look at all times that there were total eclipses in that area, New York State. And there's one that does occur around 1400. There's also one that occurs about 500 AD. I mean, 54 AD, I think it was, or 56, something like that, shortly after Christ. There was a total eclipse that occurred in Seneca territory. And some elders say that's how old the Great Law is. And so they've been around for a long time. And so the people that we had first contact with was the Dutch. And so this two-row wampum belt was created in 1613. And this is the first treaty made by the 5 nations known as the Iroquois Confederacy with a European country. And this document establishes the premises for all future treaties of the sovereignty of the 5 nations and other European countries. Our very first contact with any European nation was with the French in 1613. Just 2 years later, we made this treaty. And at Nichols Pond, and that's up the hill from Oneida Lake there. There was a settlement that was there that was with the palisade and everything. It was a siege. The Hurons who are Iroquois had aligned themselves with the French, and they came into our territory, and it was a battle that ensued, and but nobody really won. But they tried to burn us down, but it didn't work because they say that the palisade was so sophisticated that it had troughs up there, and so when they chuck those fire bombs in there to burn it, they released the water and it went through there, and they were able to extinguish those fires. So 1611 was our very first contact with the any European, for the Oneidas. So that's quite a while after, 1492 when Columbus ended up down in the Caribbean there. So 2 years. It's a replica of that treaty belt, and what it is, it's a white belt, and there's 2 lines going across it, and it's made from the wampum beads. And what the elders talk about, the significance of that belt is that this is our understanding of the sovereignty, the independence of our nations. And one of those lines represents that river that their ship is flowing or sailing in, and that within that ship is everything about them. It's how they govern themselves, their laws and everything. It's their whole economic system, their culture, and that's all inside of that in their ship, and how they function socially, everything about them, their whole cosmology is inside of their ship. And it's running parallel with the other one. And the other one represents our canoe. And inside of our canoe is everything about us. Everything, from the creation story up until that time. All of our ways, our laws, clan system, their ceremonies, our medicine society, the clan system, how we govern ourselves traditionally, the chiefs, the clan mothers. Everything about us is inside of our canoe, how we sustained ourselves, economically. So that's what's inside of that canoe. And we're independent of one another. And that there's this mutual respect, that we're going to have. And that anything that's in your ship is going to stay there, and everything in our canoe is going to stay in our canoe. And that's how we're going to coexist like that. There's going to be that mutual respect. But if there ever comes a time when somebody wants to jump out of their ship, or that saying, abandoned ship, that's where that came from. And they swim over to our canoe, open arms. But they're going to come just like newborn babies. And we're going to immerse them into our way of life. They're going to learn our language, everything about us. They're going to become us. They're going to have a clan. They're going to have a grandmother. They're going to have a chief. They're going to have a role within that family that adopts them. And we're going to immerse them. That's assimilation, right? Yeah. And vice versa, if somebody from our canoe wants to jump ship or get out of our canoe, flip that canoe over, that's where Tippy Canoe comes from, go over to that ship, they can as well. And then they're going to be immersed in that whole cosmology there. They're going to become that. And none of those things are going to come out into art and vice versa. That's the understanding of what that two-row wampum belt is about. I'll have to bring that. We did a handout on all the wampum belts. Like the Oneida Nation belt, that comes way later, after the Revolutionary War. But there's these ones in here, like this is and the ones prior to that with Great Law, that's when that will come out. But there's the write-up that Bob Brown had did a little bit on each one of those significant wampum belts. And we're not really going to get to that until we get to our stuff, when we talk about the Great Law. But I think we left that one out of the packet. I was thinking about it yesterday, and I was all over the place yesterday. So what this does is it establishes that sovereignty, the mutual sovereignty of these two governments, and that's how the relationship is going to be, from this day forward. Well, by 1702, this is when, I guess, they didn't respect that, and we had a church built in our territory in New York State. So our people were beginning to cross over. And prior to this, there was people that were being sent over to Europe to be educated in their system as well. And coming back, the Mohawks, Joseph Bratton was one of them, very influential during the Revolutionary War. And so these priests, these people of the cloth, they were like the front runners, so to speak, in terms of acculturating our people. And remember, it's in the name of the church, to Christianize our people. And so this is where we start about, we talk about like the divide and conquer. The divide and conquer people, we have to factionalize them. And one of the ways, was with religion. Holy war. And so for us as Oneidas, we've had people within our nation that have been Christianized for well over 300 years. Families today. That's how long that we've been Christianized. And as we continue down the timeline here, the 5 nations became the 6 nations around 1720, sometime in there. I was out to Tuscarora this summer when we did the recital out there, and there's some young guys there that are learning, they're revitalizing the Tuscarora language. There was one young guy in particular, Monty Hill, who went to the Mohawk immersion school up in 6 Nations. It's a 2-year immersion. You're a functional speaker when you go through that program. The Oneidas just started one out at the Thames. Same curriculum. They flipped it out into Oneida. And so he came back to Tuscarora, and he's flipping everything into Tuscarora. And so we got to hear that language every day. They're the ones that did that opening every day, and they closed it up every day. And they ran the social dances as well. And it was all in the Tuscarora language. And their territory was down in the Carolinas. And there's a guy there, he did a whole timeline on their history from the time of contact until how they came up into our territories. With that expansion of those European communities and the expulsion of those native peoples, you know, and the wars that went on and all of that. And he gave me, so he had it all on PowerPoint. And, so I thought, well, I'll get that PowerPoint and I don't have to take any notes. And I don't know if it was on that last.
I didn't get a chance to look at it.
Because I don't know what happened to that little flash drive. I got a whole bunch of them, and I was looking through all of them to find, because he has a date in there when they left their territories. They were, you know, it talks about a whole series of wars that they went through, and that they were almost rubbed out, and there was the surviving ones came up, and they sought refuge under the 5 nations. And one of the responsibilities that we have as the Oneida Nation within the Confederacy is that when other foreign nations come into our territories, we host them, the Oneidas, the ones that come from the east, the ones that come from the west, the Cayugas, they have that responsibility. So we put them, so we designate an area within our territory where they can settle and establish themselves, just like we did with the Stockbridge. They came into the Brotherton, the Muncies, all those, when they got booted out of the New England area there, and they came and sought refuge in our territory, we hosted them. They came with us out here. They walked. We came on a boat. But, so the Tuscaroras, they did that. And they have a date in there when they were acknowledged as the Sixth Nation at a Grand Council. And a lot of historians say it's around 1720, somewhere in there. But he had a date on there, and I can't remember exactly what it was. But he made a lot of references in there of the Six Nations and the date that changed from 5 to the Six Nations. So that's when they came into being here. Now, the Revolutionary War, prior to this war, there was all of these forces, the English, the British, the colonists, that were vying for allegiance, you know, with this pending war. And each one had these people that would come in, and they would establish relationships, and they would give them goods and stuff like that. And prior to this, there was all kinds of wars that was going on. And a lot of it was based on the fur trade. That was a really, really big thing back then. And the Haudenosaunee were right in the heartbed of it, from everything coming from the west going to the east. And so they had to come through us. And we got stories of our people coming all the way out here and fighting with the Ho-Chunk and the Menominee and the Potawatomis, the Ojibwe, they were over that. To be the, what do you call it, the guy that, there's a word for that, gatekeeper, the middleman, for all these European nations that were seeking those furs, eh? And so they established these relationships, you know, the French and British and the colonists, and so different nations started having allegiance with these different nations. This part of the territory is all French. So you got like the Menominee, they got a lot of French names. Lac Vidédel, Lac Flabo. You know, a lot of French, you know, even in their last names, you know, derived from the French, because this was, all of this territory here was all under the influence of the French. So that war between the colonists and you know, British, it came down to well, who's your allegiance to, right? Which nations? Yes.
Really just on your comment of the last names kind of being an influence. So traditionally, we didn't have last names.
No.
So the whole,
We never had last
we
names.
didn't have that. That got established when getting colonized.
Right, when we started, when boarding school was a part of it,
Okay.
and we were given last names, And then there was interracial marriages that went on where last names started to happen. Like Cornelius goes all the way back to the Dutch. That's where Cornelius comes from. There's a whole bunch of them over there. You know, so we can trace everybody's last names to what nation that they're derived from. You know, we never had last names. If anything, close to a last name would be your clan. You know, we had your name, your first name, and that's what everything in creation recognized you as, you know, knew you as, and everybody. That's what we would call them. So the war here, it literally split the 6 nations. And at the Grand Council, and the clan mothers and the chiefs were losing that battle with the warriors. Different men, remember those ones that went across the ocean, got educated? They're saying, no, we got to fight with the British, or no, we're going to fight with the English, you know, or 13 colonists. And they began to have more influence over our political and spiritual leaders. And so a lot of the men, they fought with the British, you know, and some fought with the 13 colonists, and some remained neutral. And we have stories of that war, of within nations, brothers taking sides, opposite sides. And I remember Bob talking about a family, Oneida family. One guy, he fought with the British, and his brother, he fought with the colonists. And there was a battle, and one of the brothers died. The other brother didn't kill him, but one of the brothers died in that. So you think about that, like your own family, you got a brother or sister, and you're so opposed to one another that you would want to kill each other. That's what that war did. It did that with the whole Confederacy. Up and down, every nation. Majority of the Senecas, Mohawks, Onondagas, those men in particular fought with the British. And the Oneidas, the majority of our men, we fought with the colonists. And during that war, we were the scouts. And we led George Washington and all those into the heartland of our territory, the Haudenosaunee territory. That was the battlegrounds. And in 1779, in that summer of 1799, the corn is green. George Washington, he sends in Sullivan and Clinton to annihilate the 6 nations. And so we have journals. We have journals of those people that came into our territory, and they destroyed everything, just totally annihilated everything. And that's when George Washington got his name, his Oneida name, Oneida. Oneida is like a village or a town. Oneida means he totally annihilated, he totally destroyed it. And what they did was they burned everything to the ground. I read Sullivan's journal. He kept a journal. And he tells every village they came to, how many people they killed, how much livestock, how many homes, how many orchards, how much corn was destroyed, how many acres of corn was in gardens. Hundreds, thousands of acres just totally destroyed. Orchards, just hundreds of acres of orchards just totally destroyed. Millions, something like 6 million bushels of corn was burned. So it was a direct attack at the 6 nations people. And the faction of Oneidas that followed him during that war were the people that led him into that territory, to the interior of New York State, because there wasn't any settlements inside of that. They had different forts on the outskirts, but inside there wasn't any. And the big reason why they did that was for the land, because Georgie, that's what I call him, he promised every one of those men that volunteered so many acres, I believe it was 100 acres, I forget, it's a lot. That's what they would get paid at the end of the war. And this is where it's gonna come from. It's in our territory, and it's gonna bust it up, and so that treaty that they just had, or they're gonna have, 911. Now that's another important date, right? Very sad date for for Iroquois, because that's when Canandaigua Treaty was signed in New York State. We'll get to that. But see again about our history and significant dates of how the Alma Society has this other date to honor our veterans. And it's a very significant date in our history because of the land secessions that the Six Nations lost because of that war. So, a lot of devastation, you know. And so that was that genocidal attempt on the Six Nations during that campaign right there, that summer of 1779. And in retaliation, what they did is they came into our territory, the Oneida territory, did the same thing, just totally destroyed everything. You know? And so in that war, there's a lot of significant battles that happened where the Oneidas had a great influence on the outcome of that war. Oriskany is one in particular. And there is a statue there at that site. It's like that, what is that one, Washington Monument, I think, that big, long, tall one with the point on top? Is that what that's called?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. There's like a replica of that at that site. It's like a monument. And they've got a great big plaque on there because that was one of the major battles that happened during that war that turned the outcome of that war. And a lot of Oneida men lost their lives in that battle right there. But throughout there, and he talk about, what is that, Polly, sweet Miss Polly? Polly Cooper, you know, and the men, and they took down all those bushels of corn down to George Washington's, you know, encampment during the winter, because they're all starving. We brought all that Indian corn down there, and she showed them how to cook it and everything, and how to make all those delicacies with their Indian corn, you know, and so there's a lot of different stories about that, how the Oneidas in particular, how we helped George Washington and the 13 colonies during that war. But in terms of gaining any more favors because of that, we didn't really fare off any better than any of the other nations because there was land secession that we lost as well. So that war right there, what the Grand Council had said at that time, because the chiefs, they knew that they lost the influence over the men. And they said that whatever you decide, you know, officially we're remaining neutral. The Six Nations, they were to remain neutral. And whatever comes of that becomes of the war, right? And they say that well, some say that the fire was extinguished at that time. You know, the existence of the Five Nations because of that war. And it wasn't until later, after that war, when the Five Nations, or Six Nations, came back together, that the Oneida Nation all came to be. So if we look at New York State, now one of the things that you don't talk about is our territory down here, which is Pennsylvania, and also up here in which is Canada today. But there's all kinds of Iroquois archaeological sites that have been done up in this area. And they say that our territory also went up into Canada as well. They just talk about this here, the 6 million acres here, in which is New York State. And then we have the Mohawks over here, and then the other non-Iroquois, all Algonquin nations over here. And then to the west of us is the Onondagas. We've got the Finger Lakes here, the Cayuga and the Seneca Nations. But they go down in Pennsylvania as well, and westward as well. territories that they also had influence over.
Randy, what did you say the Oneidas gave George Washington as a name?
Lana Dagalias. So Washington DC is Lana Dagalias' name, the place of the village destroyer. And Bob, here's a picture of a village burning up. You know, it's a painting, and that's what that depicts, because that's what they did during that war. Right? Lana Dagalias. And Lana Dagalias' name. So every president, so Trumpy, that's his name, Lana Dagalias. See, because that's how our titles are. The chief ones anyhow, they get passed on, you know, to that clan. And so when that new chief is put up, that's the name that he's giving. So there's 50 of those guys. But President Trump there, that's what his name would be, Lana Dagalias.
So Randy, when you're talking about these Oneida men who led Washington into the villages, did they also attack Oneida villages? Or just,
No.
okay, just all the other
Other Iroquois nations.
So then, of course, those men who were promised 100 acres of land probably didn't get it then, right?
I would think that the ones that fought for the 13 colonists would have gotten, and I'm not exactly sure how many acres, it was a big chunk of land, that they got that because of all the land secessions that went on after the Revolutionary War. Then that's when that was turned over to those folks.
So you think they might have gotten the land, but then it was lost in the land cessions?
The Oneidas that fought?
Yeah.
I've never heard of them ever receiving any land for fighting.
Oh, okay.
It was just the colonists. That was their calling card to bring those men into the war to fight for the 13 colonists. Was that because they didn't have no money. But if we win this war, then you know that was a major reason behind that genocidal attempt. Because now we're going to have all these millions of acres of land that are open, you know, to be colonized, you know, to be settled, you know, by non-native people.
Okay. So you think because there's no evidence or no title that those men who fought on behalf of George Washington may not have received any
From that war.
from that war, from that
From the 13 colonists?
Yeah.
Well, that's the major research project there. Would get on that one?
Well, that's what they were promised, right? But then those Oneida men who fought on behalf of George Washington
Right.
and Sullivan, then if they didn't receive the promised land,
Right.
then they were betrayed.
Right. I don't know if they were compensated. I've never heard that. I don't know if you ever come across anything in the history.
I never heard anything about the Oneidas being compensated for anything, but
Right.
some of the colonists, like the higher ranking
Officers.
got
More.
land.
Yeah.
I don't know if the common soldiers did or not. Like, I don't think a lot of them did.
Yeah. I don't know what records you would go to find that out even.
Well, maybe those are the ones who were killed in Oriskany.
Yeah.
The promise didn't have to be kept.
Yeah. So now, we get into these federal policies here. We got a little bit of history, but this Non-Intercourse Act, this is after the Revolutionary War. It's the United States of America now, and Congress enacts this act. And it forbids the sale, or it forbids any state or individual from acquiring indigenous land without federal consent. Prior to this, individuals, local communities, one of the colonists, you know, they would negotiate that, you know, land secessions. But now that they're a nation, now the federal government, the Congress that was established after the Revolutionary War, they're saying now, all these 13 states here, we've taken that power away from you. So it kind of sounds like that doctrine of discovery in there somewhere. That you no longer have that authority or right to make treaties with indigenous nations for land secessions. It's just the federal government that has that authority now. And this is the premise for our land claims, is this one right here. Because that's what we go back to. Because New York State, treaty era, we had all those treaties, 26 treaties. And then the Canandaigua Treaty, what I alluded to before, 1794, what this did was it reaffirmed, you know, the independent sovereignty and land base of the Iroquois Confederacy, also known as the Six Nations, but it doesn't say that they lost a big chunk of land. You know, we lost a big chunk of land, and I don't know exactly how much it is, but it was a lot. And then the treaty era, 1795 with 1846, the last one. 26 treaties were signed with the state of New York, acquiring virtually all the 6 million acres of our ancestral homelands in New York State, so it's presently New York State. So 26. And you talk about a decline in the numbers of tribal people at that time. The war, disease, especially disease, because there's stories of when those tradings would come into indigenous territories, they would trade, bring gifts. Those blankets were infested with smallpox, you know, and they would just totally wipe out whole villages. Yeah.
When was this?
Prior to the war, or even after the war. That decimated, you know, our people, you know, and so we were really pitted wards of the state by after the Revolutionary War. And you talk about the state of the nation at that time was one of the lowest, you know, in our history. And the factionalization, you know, of our people. We basically had three groups. We had those that fought with the British, those that fought with the colonists, and those that remained neutral. But in that war, it didn't matter. And so we didn't really have much leverage in those treaties because of that, the decimation of our people. And so over time, we began looking at, you know, a different place to reestablish ourselves. And I mentioned about Gully Wee, 1799, 1815, Handsome Lake. So he was a chief. With every nation, all those 5 nations, the main 5, there was a principal chief. And Handsome Lake was the principal chief for the whole Seneca Nation. And he was an alcoholic. See, that's something else that really decimated our people, is alcohol. And so here we got a political and spiritual leader for the whole Seneca Nation. He's an alcoholic. And the story begins 4 years prior to this. And it talks about what was going on in that territory at that time. And at that time, the village is still separated. The hunters and some of the women would go to the hunting grounds, and they would, you know, go by canoe, and that's where they would come, and in the springtime they come back. And on those major rivers, there were trading posts, and that's where they would go to barter those furs. And so the first thing they did, they give them a jug of liquor, get them feeling good, then you commence the bartering, and the majority of what they would barter would be liquor. And they would have those wooden barrels, that's what they would barter for. And they would tie those canoes together, 3 abreast, and in the middle they had all those whiskey barrels, liquor barrels set up, and all the men, you know, women as well, drinking, and designated paddlers on the outside of the canoes. And they would come back to their villages like that. And the villages would send out runners anticipating when they would come back, when they could hear the ruckus coming down the rivers. And so they would go back and tell the leaders, and they would abandon their village, everybody that was there, because they knew what was going to happen with that alcohol. And so it talks about all the things that went on, all the destruction and the killing, and the beatings, and the destruction of their property, until all the liquor is gone. Then it settled down. Then the people would come back to their village. And when they came back, here's Handsome Lake, naked as a jaybird. That's where that came from. He had a hatchet in his hand. He'd come running at them like crazy. He was probably in a blackout. And so men apprehend him and take him back to his house, and he's sick for 4 years, sick. In 1794 is when there's the springtime. That's when those spirits came here. Because that last year, 1798 until the spring of 1799, he was bedridden. He was just skin and bone. And he had a daughter that took care of him, his son-in-law. And those messengers came, and came to him, and he wanted to know what he wanted. And so this is where Christianity kind of became integrated into mainstream Iroquois philosophy, because this was the introduction of the devil. Because it talks about that in there, that message. It talks about hell. We don't have that concept in our culture. I don't think any indigenous culture has that, that I'm aware of. And certainly we don't. But that's that influence of Christianity. And so 16 years they come to him, they show him all these things. And but at the same time, this was a time of revitalization too, of our stuff. And so that became more apparent in Iroquois communities, because by this time we're pretty much all Christianized. The small group of people that came here that were called the Pagan Party was like, I don't know, 40 some people. The 700 that came here. So an important piece of history, because it talks about all those things that come across the ocean, and how the devastation that it's caused our people. And then these are some things to make things right. And it's all about the culture, the revitalization of the culture. But there's a lot of teachings in there about the Punisher's world, and all of these behaviors that we see with people who are abusive, all those isms, that we live in today, all the dysfunctions that we live in today, that if you continue to practice that until you die, well, these are the consequences then for eternity. There is no forgiveness, and that's totally foreign from ours as well, because we do have forgiveness. Today there are 11 longhouses across the 5 nations that follow that. There's longhouses that don't, because of the Christian influence. They don't acknowledge it. They follow the great law. They follow the cyclical ceremonies, and things like that. Okay. 1809, this is when the Methodist Church came into our territory. And, so now we have, Episcopalians, who were the first one 100 years before that, 1702. Over 100 years later, the Methodists come into our territory, build a church, and some of our people convert over to that as well. Okay, so there's a whole handout on this. We'll bring tomorrow. But there's a lot of, it talks about, Loretta did it, it talks a lot about the, I don't know what the word is, things that were going on that facilitated the removal. You know, 1830 was the Indian Removal Act, and this is something that was being talked about many years before that. And Eleazar Williams, quite the character, there's documentation that of him coordinating with the federal representatives and having the Six Nations removed from New York State. And so he attempted that. He got his congregation, most of them to agree. There was even a split within there, some that didn't want and some that did. And there's some that went up into Canada and the rest came here. And the same within the Methodist Church, there was a split in there too. Some came here and some went up into Canada. And within the pagan, they call the pagan party, the people who weren't affiliated with any religion, were still following our traditional practices. There was a split in there as well. And but the land secessions is a big one. You know, they're pretty much forced. And by 1821, there was a group that was sent out here to meet with the Menominees and the Ho-Chunk. This is their homelands. And the Ho-Chunks didn't want anything to do with it, and they left. And so a year later, they came back again and negotiated with the Menominees. And at that time, they agreed to joint use of approximately 8.5 million acres. Is that picture in here too? Is that gone?
It's going to be two sides of
And well, this is the route we took. It was 1815. Erie Canal was built through the heartlands of our territory. It connected to the Hudson River that flowed down to New York. And so this became a very, very super duper highway. You know, and then to get into the Great Lakes and stuff. And so that's how we got here. But this is a picture. The green area is the land. It goes down to Milwaukee, Ellsworth County, up to Lake Butte, or Badenoch, all the way over to Wausau. You can see the river has boundaries.
You can't see the wording, but is that green, the 8 point whatever million?
Yeah, this green here, this is the Lake Winnebago here. That's the 8.5 million acres that the Menominees agreed, joint use. I gotta figure out, how do I go back?
back
There, oh, there, here.
So did they really agree? Because they,
Well, there's another treaty that was signed where they disagreed, and we had to pay them again. There was a money exchange as a part of that, from the money that we got from our lands in New York, and They have a different story, you know. And so they went back, and there was another treaty that was signed, and that was reduced to $500,000. And at that treaty, there was no representation there from our community. That was between the federal government and the Menominee Nation. So they reduced our $8.5 million co-usage, you know, to $1.5 million. And that's the orange. This is the orange area here. That's the 500,000 acres. This is the Wolf River right here. You know, so it goes, how far over, it goes up into the character of present reservation. This is Highway 29 right here. There's the Wolf River. Yeah, so it'd be Shawano, you know, just south of their reservation today. So when that treaty went on there, yeah, there was no representation.
So the Menominee lost all that land in Green too then, right?
Oh yeah, through negotiations with the federal government, they ended up losing all of that as well. They got totally deriving the deal, they got terminated. But this was signed by President Monroe, 1823, so that's when we came out here. And then the Stockbridge, Abutton, and Muncie, they traveled on foot, and they got their story. It took them several years. They made stops along the way, and they eventually ended up down by Lake Winnebago. So the first Christian parties were the Episcopalians. There was 448. Now, this is another research project for some graduate student. There's a Marine Manifest Museum in Buffalo. All the ships that sailed the Great Lakes during that time, they kept a manifest of what was on those ships. And we think there's names on there, one of those ships. I don't remember the name of the ship that those people came on, those schooners. Walk on the water. They almost walked under the water.
It's technically that.
Yeah. The Canadian Oneidas also had one of those walk under the water ships who was it sank after they went up into Canada on a return back to Buffalo. It sank. But there's these manifests and it tells, and we're thinking that there would be all the names, you know, of the people that were on that ship. And it took like 2 weeks or something like that, 3 weeks to get here, because there's portacals, they call it, where you, along the route, you know, just like on a train, you don't go direct. You stop at all these little towns and people get off, get on, and different goods, you know, put on the carts and stuff, and that's how it was then too. So it took a little while to get here. But that's one of the things that we had talked about and read about one time too, and you know, was going out there and see if we can find that information, you know, exactly who were all the people, because I don't think we have that information, do we? No. You know, which one of our relatives, you know, you trace your lineage back, who were on that first boat, first boat people. And then a year later, the second Christian party, the Methodists, that's when they came here. And there was 206. 1830, a new Removal Act. President Andrew Jackson is the one that signed off on that. And that actually went to the Supreme Court. Indigenous nations in opposition of that. And they actually won. But Andrew's response was, well, how are you going to enforce it? I have the army, you know. And so all these forced removals went on. The most known one is the Charioteers of the Cherokee Nation. Rounded up 15,000, you know, Cherokees, and 5,000 died before they got to Northwest Territory, the Kansas Claim area, which is Oklahoma, Kansas today. But all these other nations, the, here, the Ho-Chunk, the Potawatomis, all these other indigenous nations, that was the purpose of the act, was to remove all of them and open up all those lands for settlement, land acquisition, by conquest. So that was a federal policy. And then 1831, we mentioned about the Oneidas, where we lost 8 million acres of land there.
Is that one in Wisconsin or back in New York State?
Here.
Okay.
Okay, 8.5 million, 1822 was it? 1831, 9 years later, we reduced to 500,000 acres. And like I said, no Oneida representation at that treaty. Strictly between the Bahamians and the federal agents. One way. Now, alcohol was such a bad thing for Native Americans that the federal government actually passed a law forbidding the sale of alcohol to Indians. And it's still in effect today in some nations, like out in South Dakota. But there's no real enforcement of that, 1824. And that was one of the primary things that was first given out when they did those land secessions. Feeling good, and then also we were becoming so factionalized that there were different groups that were signing off that didn't really have the authority as well. So just a lot of things going against us here. (1838), that's when our existing reservation boundaries were established, and at the treaty at Buffalo Creek, New York. So 100 acres was divvied out. So they say there were 654 Oneidas living here at that time, 1838. And there's some disagreement with that. Loretta, she's into all kinds of stuff there, reading old history. And she says there was a lot more than that were here. But that's what they did for our reservation. For every nation, it's different, because some reservations are really huge. And
What was that total that you said was in here?
at that time, they said there were 654 Oneidas living here. And so we add up those numbers, there's what, 448 and 206, I think, 650 something, so, well, that was in 1820.
So was there a date on when the pagan group came?
Yeah,
And how many was in that
comes
total?
down here. Where is that?
The date,
Oh, the date?
Yeah, when did they come and how many was in that group?
1841 or 1840? Where, right there.
There's 44 and 1841.
Oh, okay, got it.
1841, 44. See, with each church, there was a split. There was a group of Oneidas that went up into Canada from the Episcopal Church, the Methodist Church, and the Orchard Party is what they called them. They were also known as the Pagan Party because they weren't affiliated with any church. And what they did was they purchased land from the crown. 5,000 acres in 1840. And so that was money that faction of Oneidas got from the land secessions. they paid the crown. And it straddles, the west boundary straddles the Thames, I don't know how you say that, right? Thames River on the western boundary. It's 5,000 acres, so it's less than 1 square mile, I think. Is that? No, more than that. Yeah, there's 640 acres in 1 mile. So, but it tells you how many were there: 200 in 1840 from the Episcopal Church, 160 from the Methodist Church, and 44 from the Orchard Party.
I have a question, Randy. So, if I grew up to be Episcopalian, is that to assume that my ancestors were one of the first ones to come to this area? Because I'm Episcopalian when I was younger.
Yeah, I guess.
I guess it would be a
Fair.
safe assumption, but it's only an assumption, because
Yeah.
people can convert, and people have their own free will to
I
convert,
don't
or.
know how many people
Yeah,
have done that.
See, and that's what's different for me, because I know my grandma, Margaret, went to the Episcopal Church, but my grandpa was part of the Methodist Church.
Yeah.
And so when he died and he got married in Methodist, my grandma changed over so that she could be buried next to him.
Mhm. It's in the history there.
It's like ancestry both sides, Methodist and.
Yeah. I think there was a lot of that went on between the two, you know, there was a lot of inter-religious marriages that went on, and even within the pagan party.
Yeah, and then there were other religions that came in too, like there's the First Assembly of God up there
Yeah.
by Olson Road in
Yeah.
29.
And then the Mormon Church,
Yeah.
the Lutheran Church.
Yeah.
I think there's 13 churches on the reservation.
Wow.
Yeah,
Too
so
many.
people convert and intermarry and leave, and so,
Well, when I was growing up, there was only the Stone Church, the Methodist Church, and there was that church that was actually up on a hill, where the Pauluses live now, up there.
Yeah, that was the Mormon Church.
That was a Mormon church?
Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah. So, yeah, we got,
well, when I was growing up, there were the Holy Rollers past the Mormon Church on 54.
yeah, there's stories about, I can't think of their name, what they call them, but they were like holy rollers.
Yeah, the First Assembly of God or something like that, they get touched by the Spirit and they roll around and go to the mouth and claim that they're speaking with God. And it's the
Yeah.
voice of Babylon.
Yeah, there's some stories in WPA about that.
Yeah.
You know, that was going on back in the 1800s, late 1800s, early 18th century.
But also at the same time, and it probably was the pagan party, the really old traditional ceremonial practices were underground. So
Yeah.
you might see people going to church and doing all this, church
Oh,
stuff,
yeah.
but underground, figuratively, secretly, they were still doing all
Yeah,
the old
that
ceremonies.
was all done at night.
Yeah.
Even people who are in church, like someone who gets sick, they take them to the medicine societies. It says in the WPA papers,
Yeah.
people who are Christians were still using the medicine societies and still doing things that weren't very Christian.
It was after,
Now.
yeah, well, after my grandmother, Rena John, she married, Freeman Parkhurst, and her second husband was Comey Denny. After she passed away, some of the elders in her peer group came and told my family that she was one of the people, her and Comey were one of the people who were underground during the ceremonial practices. So when people got like St. Vitus dance or whatever, they
Yeah.
would go see Comey.
Yep. Yeah, there's a lot
And
of
we
them.
didn't know that, and we're her grandchildren, both of them were fluent Oneida speakers, and they would not teach us Oneida whatsoever.
Right.
And we did not see any evidence of any ceremonial practices or objects or medicine, nothing.
Mhm.
Because up front they were saying, we're a Christian and we speak English.
Mhm. Yeah, that reminds me, that belt's not in there, the United Nation belt.
That was in the.
Wasn't in there? Put that in there.
Okay, where do you want it?
I'm not exactly sure the date though.
Yeah.
It's been after the Revolutionary War.
And then, after, I was probably like in my early twenties or something like that, when everybody, right along with everybody else in their early seventies, going to revive the Longhouse and spiritual practices and going back to Canada and all that. And I asked my grandmother, Rena, why she didn't teach us to speak Oneida.
So,
And she said because she didn't want any of her children to be beaten the way she had been. And that's always stuck with me all these years, because I'm like, wow, what would someone have to do to a person to make them promise to never ever speak their mother tongue to their children or grandchildren or great grandchildren? What
what they went
traumatized her to
through.
that her whole life
Yeah,
to say, I don't want you to be beaten the way I was.
we're gonna get to that.
And then, another thing, she said she's not gonna teach us, so I went and asked some of her friends, all of her peers, and I asked them, I said, where can I go to learn to speak Oneida? And they said to me, why don't you ask your grandmother? She's one of the most eloquent Oneida speakers around here.
Yeah,
I'm like, what? So I went to go tell my grandma what her friend said,
yeah.
and she said, what does eloquent mean? So I told her, I said, eloquent means that you speak the language in a beautiful way.
Yeah,
And man, she just lit up. She was just shining. So then the next time I saw her with her friends, she was just shining and speaking and conversing in the night.
right.
I'm like, so I missed out on that, because whoever did this to my grandmother stole a whole lot from us.
Oh, yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
You ain't the only one.
yeah. I mean all of us, not just me. I mean all of us.
Yeah.
Because in that eloquent way of speaking, there's also a whole philosophy and culture and cosmology and, relationships with everything. You know what I mean?
Yeah, it's very descriptive, the language, very visual. And that's the way I teach now. I use pictures, everything's pictures. Because that's, when you speak in a language, you're seeing something. But the way we teach it today, what we've been teaching it is just the text and memorization, eh? But it's pictures, and that's what elders always says, that when somebody's talking to them, it's just like a movie projector that's going in their head. They're seeing all these images, versus all text.
Just right on the lines on word.
Yeah.
I think that's the natural way to learn the language, because when we're teaching babies to speak, we don't show them letters. They learn by association and by action.
Yeah.
So if you say a cup of juice, you're giving to them a cup of juice or drink, so then they relate it to the action, the imagery, not
Yeah,
to
you see it.
words.